Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some components, individual components of the terrain in miniature war games, just to give you an example of how some of these things are done. They're not as complicated as people think they are when they first see them. They think, oh, this is so complex, I'll never be able to do this, it's too expensive, or other things of that nature. The fact of the matter is, they're really not that difficult. Now, this is an example of the log cabin that is from Pegasus Industries. Now, Pegasus makes a 1/72 scale. I believe this is a Russian cottage. If I hadn't said Russian, you probably would have thought this was early American or some similar nature because of the log structure. Well, the roof kind of gives it away. Early American structures, I don't think, actually have thatching like this. That's what this is supposed to represent, thatching. And it's molded. This is a hard plastic. And you can put it together. And of course, you can see we used hot glue because it goes together instantly. Also, these, I believe, snap together anyway. But it's a 1/72 scale structure. We are going to be using it going forward. 1/72 scale structures we are going to be using with our 28mm figures. And the reason for that is that the structures themselves are the approximate size for the scale demonstrated in the game table by the rest of the terrain. For instance, 28mm figures are going to be somewhat tall, but that's okay. We don't really want the buildings to be in scale with the figures because the buildings are going to be way too big. And part of the problem, or part of the benefits or issues, if you will, we use a 4-inch hexagon. So as you can see, 1/72 scale building fits right in a 4-inch hexagon perfectly, just like a tank in 1/72 scale. The tank fits on there perfectly. As a matter of fact, tank actually leaves a little bit more room in World War II, and you could have another stand or two of infantry in there, or some other kind of point defense weapon like a 50 caliber or a small anti-tank gun. But the fact remains that the 4-inch hexagon seems to be universally correct in just about all the scales we've tried. Here's an example. Now here is the building itself, 1/72 scale. Here are the trees that we use. Now what you're looking at here is basically a very thin plywood hexagon shape from Litco Aero Systems. Now they have a laser cutter, so it cuts them like perfectly. We're using these because they're very strong. They warp a little bit when you paint them because we just happen to have very, very thin ones. We actually bought these in anticipation of using them for 15mm figures, and this turned out to actually not be necessary. So we have quite a few of these. We're using them now because they're so thin for tree stands. Now you'll notice right away, and as you can see here, there's some debris left on here from when we tried to use these also for 1/72 scale ancients. We had individual figures mounted in here. We've since abandoned that as well because it's no longer necessary. It's not necessary to have a hexagon shape when you have your figures mounted. At the time, and you can see it's 2.5 inch or 3 inches, 2.5 inches I believe. We thought that that might be the better scale to go. But we went to the 4-inch hex because it was better for 1/72 scale World War II. And that kind of drove everything we did going forward years ago. So this is 2.5 inch and we're using it for trees. Now where did these trees come from? Obviously they're toys. These are not model trees. So we got these trees in a massive bulk from an online store, and we're using these trees. You've probably seen bags and bags of these toy trees. They sometimes come packaged in all different kinds of things, obviously from China. But what's interesting about this is that when we started getting these trees, we noticed something. These individual branches and their leaves are removable. So in other words, if we pulled all the leaves off here, all these stems with the leaves on them, this tree would look like a dead tree with just branches on it. Just a post going up into the air with, you know, rising up with lines, branches coming off of it. Well, this is where we then came up with this, a cornfield. Because believe it or not, cornfield is really hard to represent. The materials for obtaining, to create a cornfield are not actually that easy. Well, when we found these, we thought, wow, again, master glue gunning, right? The glue gunning made it completely possible. Now remember, of course, these are plastic. So the hot glue is going to melt them a little bit, so you have to be a little careful. As you're putting these on, a little bit of blowing on it a little bit will take that heat away and solidify that hot glue. These things will stay in place fairly quickly. You can also have a fan going as you're putting the glue and this thing together onto this base. Of course, it's just balsa, so it's not a problem. And we painted it brown so it would stand out as opposed to green. Now, another thing that we tried to do, and people have tried this as well, this one's squished down. If you will, these are pipe cleaners. This type of pipe cleaner, green color, if you will, becomes more available at a craft store during or close to the holiday season, Christmas, and the fall season, where these kinds of green wreaths might be decorative for the craft business. But we tried these, and as you can see, we had to cement them, well, push them straight through actually into this thicker balsa. Hence the reason that these are a little bit difficult to do, but the results are a little more realistic as a cornfield than this. But however, these are much easier to do. You don't have to pierce that board at all, and the glue sets pretty fast. As I said, with a little fan blowing or something of that nature to make that glue cool off. And you can make these by the hundreds. These, of course, are in strands, and you have to cut them to this length. You have to take a wire snips and cut from a big strand of this pipe cleaning, whatever it's called, material. So you need to make these by cutting it. And, well, frankly, it's not that easy because this is pretty strong steel in here. It's actually a steel post. These are all intertwined in a twisted steel. These are plastic, little shards, if you will, but they're twined into this metal, and that has to be cut. So you need a wire snips to do that. And of course, these just pull off. So there we have kind of a cornfield. Now here we're going to talk about something else as well. This is an example of a toy fence. It's not that much to look at. Okay, it's just a toy, not a model. You didn't have to put it together or anything. But the fact is, it's already made. Okay? Now, you'll see we've cut off the extra rung on the top. It used to be this tall. Right? We cut it off to make it this tall. Why did we want to do that? Well, we needed this height, and we wanted the plastic fence because these things are indestructible. They're virtually, you can throw them around the game table, knock them over and so on, and you don't have to worry about it. And we didn't have to make anything. Of course, look how thin it is. It's not that realistic. It's kind of a 2D fence made of plastic. But the point is, it's cheap. Okay, again, we're being cheapskates in this hobby. We're trying to conserve as much money as possible so we can put them into the figures. Or the models themselves, which are expensive and getting more expensive. These fences are in all different kinds of toy bags, again, from China. Animals, farm, whatever, all different kinds of bagged toys. You'll see these fences. They are formed to these, the posts are formed to these bases, which again makes them very attractive because they sit up pretty nice. And of course, when you have corrugated paper like this, okay, representing a field, you can slip these right underneath, just like that. So it's very interesting. Now here's another thing too we've noticed. If we wanted to form a corner, you could do this. We don't want to do this per se, but it can be done. Just bend it right here. Bend the plastic. Use a hot glue gun if you can. Heat this up and bend it to make a corner. So you essentially would just take this and just bend it. But we don't do that because these We want to maintain the length. We need that length, because sometimes you'll have long, as you see right here behind us, long rows of fencing. So to make a corner, we just add another. Okay, and you can see it overflows a little bit right here. It's not perfect. Well, these were cut beforehand, this corrugated paper, of course. So it's not perfect. But another one over here, right here, and right here would pretty much complete it. And this is, ironically, about 4 inches. I need to cut this a little bit. We'd probably cut it off right here to be an actual 4-inch size or approximate size field. And again, that's about, say it's 100 yards. In the 28 millimeter horse and musket scale, if you will, even pike and shot. Well, actually not pike and shot. In the smoothbore rifled musket era, this 4-inch hex might equal actually, possibly not 100. We've talked about this. It could be 100 yards, because 4 of these would be 400 yards. That's pretty far. That's extremely far, actually. But that's the maximum range, and that's, ironically, again, coincidentally, that's how far our rules go. 4 hexes. 400 yards is the maximum you could fire a rifled musket. Well, with any assurance of hitting something. And even then, you wouldn't want to, because you'd be just, taking the chance of wasting ammo. You wouldn't be hitting that much. So they really rarely engaged at 400 yards. Technically, actually, by the research, they engaged at about 300 yards at the most. Now that's imagine that. It's a 300 yards. It's 3 football field lengths. Could you see that far in the east of the American Civil War? Not really. The vegetation, the tree growth was so strong, so prevalent that you'd be lucky to see 200 yards in any given day, I suppose. Out west, of course, Arkansas, Kentucky, you have rolling plains. Trees didn't actually, get that kind of density out there. Okay, so that's that. That's a little quickie view on some items of the terrain, and then we'll talk about the next thing here, which is this idea or the issue of hills and their slopings, and what material to use. First off, you can see that this is approximately 1 inch in height. And we've used a hot wire gun, whatever it's called. Anyway, so it's a shaping tool with a wand. It's a wand. And it's got a wire that gets hot when you plug it in. So it's kind of like a hot knife, but it's a wire filament. And you just cut these slopes. You've seen these, they're on eBay and everything. Craft stores, hobby stores. But this is a 1 inch height. It's just simple white polystyrene foam. Okay, why did we use this and not like 2 inch thick? Well, because 1 inch cuts a lot easier. And when you put another level on, you get a gradual slope going up. So you put another level on here, another level on here, another level. And of course that means that the size of the hill has to be big enough for multiple layers. Otherwise, if they're too close to the edge, that's a really steep hill. And the likelihood of anybody climbing a really steep hill and maintaining formation, or even not being exhausted by the time they get up there is not very likely. So you need to have a size of a slope that's good for the unit to just sit on. If it doesn't quite make it on top of the hill, you can put it on the slope, okay, it's not a big deal. But the point is, the next slope doesn't really want to come right up to this. You're unlikely to be able to cut it with that much accuracy anyway. So the next hill is actually going to be like this. It's going to come in like this. So it's going to be pretty small in order to maintain that contour shape. So you really have to start with a bigger hill. And this is an example. I'll zoom out and show you this. But you can see that if we had another level on here to back it out away from the edge, it wouldn't be very big. As a matter of fact, this would be actually probably more appropriate, this level. Now this is a different type of hill. We'll talk about this in a minute. But then another hill would have to come in and you'd have to be kind of like not toward the edge, because generally speaking what you want to do is you want to let players know the closer an object is to another object, it indicates a very steep hill. This would be very steep here because these two things are very close. The edge here and the edge here are very close. That indicates a very steep hill. If this was backed out, if there was a distance here, obviously it doesn't mean that it goes up and flattens out and goes up and flattens out again. It simply means that it's a very gradual, because the distance from here, for instance, to here is so, longer. So the closer you get, the steeper the hill. Why does that matter? Well, in some rules, this would count very heavily toward the fatigue a unit might suffer. Technically speaking, if you wanted to be able to have that kind of accuracy, you'd probably have to show that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's the way you do it. It simply means you could do it that way. So this again is our 1-inch styrofoam, and this is a hill that we made from a sheet of polystyrene that's flocked already. It's flat. But you form it onto an object, and then using a hot blowing tool, again, blowing hot air like a hairdryer. It's a tool meant to melt this. It melts the polystyrene onto whatever form you've got. In this case, it's probably just a piece of foam in there because we're experimenting with the idea of doing this. And we glued it onto a piece of cardstock. In this case, it's matte board, green color. So we experimented with this and we thought, this is kind of interesting. It does create a fairly thick edge here, but it also creates a very interesting look. It's kind of realistic. We could paint and flock this, and also because it's made of plastic, when you heat it, sometimes the flocking comes off and this looks like, stone coming out of the ground. It's very interesting. And you can see there's a bit of a lip here. Why? Well, because when this gets finished, it needs to be melted down a little bit. Again, because it's plastic, you can take a hot glue gun and just kind of melt this edge nice and flat. And that's kind of like what we tried to do here. But the cardstock was very thick. And of course, necessarily so, because it makes a very strong hill. As you know, the big problem in war games is always the issue of rivers and roads, and not to mention also the fact of fields. Now, before I actually go to the rivers, the roads, let me just show you some field concepts. This is not unusual or new or anything, but it's sometimes hard to find corrugated fabric. This is an example of a field, again, a plowed field. Look, that we put a little hexagon shape onto, but it wasn't necessary. But the point is that it just looks different. It just looks different. And that's good, because you want to have some different look to your game tables. And this is an example right here. So that's a fabric. The other option, this is a different fabric. Again, a different corrugated fabric. From a fabric store, craft store even. This is a smaller corrugation. You can see it right there. And what I'm holding it up with is another concept that we had, basically just a big piece of cardstock, mat board if you will. We put some hexagons on them again so that it could lay out properly on the table, whichever way we wanted. And we would be able to measure. Count, if you will, troops moving through the plowed field. But again, it's not necessary. It's just an idea that we had. It's no longer needed because we've decided if the terrain you're putting down blocks the hex grid underneath it, whatever grid you're using, then simply go back to using a dowel rod. Okay? You've already laid out the dowel. You've been using them. Just measure as you go across. As you go across the field, just measure where you're going. But that's the idea. This, again, is just printed. This was a paper that we printed on the computer and then put on this cardstock. So it looks like a plowed field, but it's very rigid because it's on that cardstock. So those are some fields. Now another thing, of course, and this is the reason why we're showing this, is that you can see that putting this on the hill, the fabric works much better. It goes up the slope of the hill. So again, another reason why having a 2-inch hill, or a 1-inch I should say, followed by another inch is helpful. You can see it just goes right up the slope. So it's very interesting. So fabric for fields. And of course there are many people now that manufacture rubberized silicone rubber shapes and such. Well, that's exactly a good segue into what we've got here. You've seen us talk about the, I call it the silicone rubberized paper, if you will, from Wargamers Terrain for these rivers. These rivers are good, but that's a major actual creek run river, if you will. It's not like the size of the Tennessee River or anything of that nature, not the Mississippi, of course, but it's a pretty thick, I should say, wide river. It's not a minor obstacle, it's kind of a major obstacle. So could we have purchased the thinner ones? Yes, but we went for the average and got the thicker. I think it's a 3-inch or 2.5 inches from edge to edge. But it doesn't always work because it's very thick. We want a decorative one. We don't want a heavy obstacle on the game table. We want something decorative. So hence what we've got behind us. Behind it. This is another rubber right here that we've discovered. We don't actually remember where this came from. There's no name printed on it, but it definitely must be available somewhere, at some hobby store, online or something. But as you can see, it's silicone rubber. It's very thin. And it's not flocked or anything like the Wargamers Terrain is. It's just blue silicone. And it has raised edges, as you can see. So it does have a raised edge. It's kind of nice to look at. And there's some, waving, some waves in the water and so on. The person that sculpted this did a pretty good job. But we just don't know where these came from. We would like to get more of these because they're very flexible. These would actually also make good roads. So we'll keep our eyes out for these and get them again when we can. Why? Because they're thin. Not thick, thin, but they're not wide, see? So this is kind of a decorative river. This is, I believe, actually for either 10 millimeter or 15 millimeter scale figures, but in our larger scale, this becomes a very small tributary, a very small creek. Not a major obstacle at all, and that's what we're looking for. So another concept is to use foamies. Again, from a craft store. It's just foam. You can cut it with a scissors. It's a big sheet, and you can cut it for however you need. You just lay the sheet down, kind of trace it where you want it to go, and cut it out with the scissors. That's what this is. So it's just a decorative river. It's not a decorative creek. It's not a major problem. It's just meant to break up the terrain a little bit. And of course we didn't use a navy blue. We didn't use a green. We went for this high contrast look because we broadcast these games. So we went for this light blue, if you will, sky blue. But the point is, you can get sheets and sheets and sheets of this. Again, we are so cheap. But it's very inexpensive. And you can cut whatever shape you want yourself. Okay? And you do the same for roads. Here's an example. You can get different colors. So here we are, different roads. You can see right here the colors are a little different, matching them up. But these again were 15 millimeters, so the bases are different size. But again, it's easy to do and very inexpensive to put these down. You just cut them however you want them, you match them up, and there you go. So there's one other thing that's very helpful in this, and that is blue masking tape. Well, depending on the surface of your game table, be it fabric or in this case a painted canvas, Blue masking tape, this size, I believe it's 2-inch, is actually very beneficial. Why? Because we can actually trim it out. We can cut an edge here, okay, and put this tape down. We can either cut it before we put it down or cut it after, because it's so thin. It's just masking tape. So we can put it down on the game table. We don't really want to do that though, do we? Because then we'll cut through our fabric. So what we'll do, clean this up, starting off with a nice edge, we'll actually cut this on the roll. And you'll see I'll make a decorative kind of shape to it for the banks of the river, just by using an X-Acto blade. Again, set your depth. You don't want to go too deep, so you want to be careful. So just an example. I'll just cut a decorative edging on this. Just a little weaving. And I'll actually, what I'll do is, I'll cut a curve. And I'm going to do the same for the other side. Kind of again, bearing in mind how big I want my banks to look. And also bearing in mind I don't want to cut too deep. And also bearing in mind that I'm coming up to my curve. So I need to start finishing the curve here. Oh, I kind of screwed up. Let's see if I can fix that. But again, it's just a demonstration, showing you how it can be done. Okay, so there's my river coming off with a decorative edging, like a bank of an actual river. And then there you can see I screwed up my little curve, but we'll see if I can resurrect it. And well, it's just tape anyway, so I can put it down and build it however I want. Okay, so there's my mistake. Yep, right there. So I'm going to put my little river down, curve it around. It's actually more, I'm making more of it than it actually needs to. I mean, I could do this by putting it down first and being very careful. Simply peel up another piece of tape. So I've peeled off the extra for the river. And you can see I'm just going to shape them, match them up. So I'm just going to match them up right now, and you can see how you can cut it, you can lay it down in a curved shape. Using the X-Acto knife, you can actually hold it, let it down, cut it like this, and begin to change your curving nature just by tearing it, and so on. And the beautiful thing about masking tape, of course, is that especially on this painted canvas, the masking tape won't stick that well. Duct tape might affect the paint that we've got on the canvas, but the masking tape doesn't. You can actually peel that right off again. And there's your river now gone, and throw it away. So there we are with some tips and some pointers about how to do rivers and roads. Thanks for watching, and next time let's get right back into doing some gaming, showing you how all this stuff comes together on the game table, and how we can make the table more attractive.